We are live now, Professor Chadha. We can begin.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time zone people who are attending are, and a very warm welcome to this webinar today. The webinar on fractured global value chains post COVID-19. Can India gain its missed glory? And as you can see, we have a wonderful group of expert and esteemed panelists with us, and that is the reason that why I started thinking of this. What I'll do is I'll quickly run through the idea behind, and what interested me is in the economic survey this time, chapter 5 talks about creating jobs and growth by specializing to exports in network products. And that reminded me of a piece on which I was a discussant for Professor Athukorala some years back. And the backdrop for those who would like to know a little bit, it is very much intertwined with the trade, international trade, starting with the absolute advantage discussions to comparative advantage by David Ricardo. And one of the economists that I read a lot and discuss a lot is Kaname Akamatsu. He was a Japanese economist who talked about the flying geese paradigm, that is the production platforms keep shifting from the high wage economies to the low wage economies for producing. And later the process of splintering of the production process, when production is now being conducted at multiple stages. So that became, that our panelists would be enlightening us on the global value chains. On January 12th this year, we had a very good panel discussion at Brookings India, where our friend, Dr. Aaditya Mattoo, had made a presentation on the World Development Report, which is Trading for Development in the Age of Global Value Chains. Interestingly, that was a pre-COVID period, as is being called nowadays. And we were having Dr. Harsha Vardhana Singh and Dr. Amita Batra as two discussants on that day. Later, when this COVID issue came, I did a small blog on Brookings India website that is Fractured Global Value Chains, the topic of the day. And that's the reason that we are having this webinar today. After that, I actually went through the literature, and Dr. Aaditya Mattoo is obviously there because he had presented the wonderful report that World Development Report, World Bank has produced. Then I also thought of Dr. Harsh Vardhan Singh, and I read through one of his very good papers, very brief, short, but very nice paper on India's trade policy reform for a competitive, evolving global trade regime, April 2019. It was done for Pune International Center, and I was sure that I'm going to have Dr. Harsh Vardhan in the discussion. With Professor Prem Chandra Athukorala, I go a long way, maybe more than 2 decades that we know each other, and I know his work. I was a discussant on one of his very famous papers on how India fits into global production sharing, experience, prospects, and policy options. It was an IPF paper, 2013-14. I was a discussant along with Mihir Desai on that. And then I also saw his recent paper on joining global production networks, published in Asia Economic Policy Review. And I also went through Dr. Rana Hassan's write-up, and one of the articles that attracted my attention immediately was, do Asian countries upgrade in global value chains? A novel approach and empirical evidence on which he's a co-author in Asian Economic Journal. And he's currently doing work on realizing India's manufacturing potential, the role of coastal corridors, and he would be making some remarks and comments on that. So first of all, please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaditya Mattoo, Dr. Harsh Vardhan Singh, Professor Prem Chandra Athukorala, Dr. Rana Hassan, to this very important discussion today, which is even more important in the post-COVID fractured global value chains. It is also my pleasant duty to introduce, because I understand that many of the participants, we know each other well for many years, but many of the participants would not know about those who are working on trade and from economics would definitely know. But I would take another couple of minutes for each introduction so that you know that who you are listening to. I'll begin with Dr. Vardhana Singh. He is chairman ICDWAJ Advisors LLP, a consulting firm on trade policy, industrial policy, and regulatory issues. He is also senior fellow at the Council on Emerging Market Enterprises at the Fletcher School and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Washington, D.C. Uh, there was a screen flip. In India, he has been executive director of Brookings India itself, and earlier the economic advisor and then secretary, TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority. For about 20 years, over two stints, he worked at the GATT WTO Secretariat, the second one from 2005 to 2013 as Deputy Director General of WTO. At GATT WTO, he worked in several areas such as economic research, trade policy reviews, GATT rules, agriculture, services, trade and environment, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and electronic commerce. He has been senior fellow at think tanks in India and abroad, taught at the universities in the US and China, been a member of high-level expert groups and chairperson of WTO dispute settlement panels. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Harshvardhan, and pleasure that you are with us. And then I move over to Dr. Aaditya Mattoo, a long-term friend, and we had co-organized a big conference in Delhi, which was published later in a book. Dr. Aaditya Mattoo is Chief Economist at the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. He specializes in development, trade, and international cooperation and provides policy advice to governments. He is also co-director of the World Development Report 2020 on global value chains. Before this, he was the research manager, trade and integration at the World Bank. Before he joined the bank, Aaditya was economic counselor at the World Trade Organization and taught economics at the University of Sussex and Churchill College, Cambridge University. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Cambridge and an MPhil in economics from University of Oxford. He has published on development, trade in services, and international trade agreements in academic and other journals, and his work has been cited in The Economist, Financial Times, New York Times, and the Time magazine. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Mattoo, and thank you very much for agreeing to join us this evening. Professor Prem Chandra Athu Korala, again, long-term friend, he is the professor of economics at Art Cordon Department of Economics, Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University, Australia, Canberra. He is also honorary professorial research fellow at the School of Environment and Development, University of Manchester, UK, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Professor Athu Korala's research interests are multiple and works on macroeconomics and international trade. And his publication count is 10 books, 7 edited volumes, 120 papers, 80 chapters, and obviously a lot more. He has served at various times as a consultant to the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Asian Development Bank Institute, International Labour Organization, UNIDO, WTO, UNCTAD, and so on and so forth. So these assignments have resulted in work on multiple countries, which include Bangladesh, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Georgia, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, to count a few. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Atu Korala. Dr. Rana Hassan, probably the youngest in the group. Again, he is a director in the Asian Development Bank's Economic Research and Regional Coordination Department. His research areas and interests include industrial development, labor economics, poverty and inequality, and urban economics. His previous positions have included serving as principal economist in ADB's India resident mission, and which is very close to Brookings, by the way, and as a fellow at the East-West Center, USA. His research has been published in various journals, including the Journal of Development Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, and World Development. He has also co-edited 2 volumes on trade and labor-related issues. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland and a master's in economics from the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. A very warm welcome to you, Rana, for joining us, and thank you very much. With this, I think I have tried briefly introducing the topic and also introducing esteemed panelists for the day today. And the order of the discussion, as we have thought about, is that about 10 minutes in the initial remarks, we will be starting with Aaditya. Aaditya, you are the first speaker, and 10 minutes to you. 12 is the upper limit. And Chandra, Professor Atu Korala, you will be after Aaditya. And after that, Rana will be joining. So Dr. Hassan, you will be then on. And Dr. Harsha Singh would be speaking towards the end. And ideally, if we finish by about 50 minutes from now or 40 minutes from now, we'll have some very good half an hour left for discussion, which I'll really appreciate. Please don't mind if I stop you in between if you cross 11 minutes. Over to you, Aaditya.
Thank you very much, Rajesh. I didn't expect this. I expected Harsh to begin, but let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see it already, my screen?
Yes, if you wish to maximum. Yes, now it is perfect.
Thank you very much, Rajesh, for inviting me and for your warm introduction. I have the happiest memories of our joint work together. Today, I propose to address 4 questions. 1, what do we learn from past shocks to the global economy? How has India engaged so far in global value chains and why? Third, how is the COVID-19 shock different from previous shocks? And finally, how should India approach the post-COVID-19 world? I had expected Harsh would have set out a context, so I was trying to differentiate my presentation from what I expected him to say, and the more insightful comments that would have come from him and from Rana. But let me try and show you a few slightly elements from new research, and then in a way that I hope will complement the more textured presentations that will come from my co-panelists. I think one big shock that the world economy suffered was the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan. I picked this as an example because Japan was deeply integrated into global value chains for both automobile components and electronics, 2 of the sectors which have seen the fastest growth in global value chains in recent years. And the question that many people are asking today is, are we likely to see in response to a shock reshoring, diversifying, restocking, or switching away from certain countries which have been hit by global shocks? Now, the Tohoku earthquake was qualitatively different from the COVID shock, but it's very interesting to see that when you look at the period after the 2011 shock, there was no sign of reshore. In fact, global imports of automotive components continued to grow. I'm showing you pictures, but even if you do more rigorous econometric work, we see that there is absolutely no sign that of a retreat from global value chains. What you do see is very interesting, that countries chose to switch away from Japan where they were highly dependent. So where there were components, let's say like engines, where they depended a lot on Japan, they switched away after 2011. But where they were less dependent, in the sense that Japan had a small share of their imports, like for example, let's say in car batteries, those are the areas where there wasn't much change. This suggests that in areas of high dependence, other competitive suppliers seem to have gained the market lost by Japan. Also interesting is we don't see any sign of diversification. When we calculate indicators of concentration, trade remained concentrated, which means that the switch wasn't to a magnitude that would have, for example, lowered the Herfindahl index. By and large, countries switched away to other major suppliers. The final interesting element from this past shock is that there was, in fact, a switch away from industrial country sources and towards developing countries. As you see on the left, there is this picture which shows a steady increase in the share of developing countries and a steady continued decline. Again, these are actual data shares, but when you try and do this econometrically, controlling for other elements, you still find this a robust result. But surprisingly, one country which did not benefit, which had in fact seen a significant growth in its share of automotive components till the point of the shock, in that post-crisis period, India's share remained more or less flat. So this brings me to the first lesson. Reconfiguration in response to shocks still respects fundamentals. Countries switch where production costs are low, trade costs are low, and countries which are reliable, stable, and have good, strong institutions. In light of this first shock, which I recognize is very different from the COVID shock, I think the point is we must be careful about what we are anticipating in terms of the post-COVID world. How will it be different, and how far do the challenges that we face remain primarily domestic challenges? Now, when it comes to India, it has already participated in global value chain. Some people think that India is out of it. That's not true. When you look at India's major exports and imports, they very clearly suggest quite deep engagement in global value chains. For example, India imports crude petroleum and processes it, works with it to export to other countries petrochemicals. Rough diamonds become polished stones and jewelry. Bulk chemicals become part of the formulations of medicines that India exports. And components of automobiles, especially for larger cars, are then built into automobiles which India exports. And similarly, in services, for example, India exports computers, but then exports services. But India's participation is relatively low. If you see this chart on the left, global value chain participation in terms of some simple measures steadily had increased and then flattened around the period of the Great Crisis. India's similarly grew and flattened, but at about a quarter less than global levels. Now, one key point I want to make is that India has both underachieved and overachieved in global value chains. In the World Development Report, we talk of different transitions, and what is striking is that the first transition from commodities to labor-intensive manufacturing, India failed to take full advantage of that. Instead, we see a precocious second transition, which usually happens at a later stage of development, where India has actually demonstrated comparative advantage in both basic manufacturing and in more advanced manufacturing and services. This is work from the previous economic survey, which validates or confirms this point that India's growth in labor-intensive manufacturers like apparel and leather in the post-takeoff phase in India, which started in the 80s, late 80s, has been significantly lower than comparable growth in other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, which saw growth rates in excess of 20-25% in these sectors. India's was hovering around 12% in apparel and 5% in leather. But as I said, the interesting thing is that India has revealed a powerful comparative advantage, especially in categories of business services. This you all know about. Why do we see this precocious transition? And this will be area that my co-panelists will cover, but let me say that this puzzle really is explained by the relative rigidity of the market for low-skilled labor. So there are interesting developments of how firms are being able to circumvent these regulations through contractual changes. The relative slow improvement in the hard infrastructure which delivers goods relative to in services, the relatively restrictive trade policy, and this is perhaps the central problem that I would like to highlight in a trade policy context. Nothing is clearer that an attempt to do everything means that you do nothing well. Countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia, which were not blessed or cursed with a domestic textile industry, have now faster growth, and in Bangladesh case, a higher share of global apparel than India, precisely because they are importing textiles and exporting garments. India's high tariffs and relatively weak condition of the domestic textile industry has inhibited its ability to participate in global value chains. Similarly, India's poor access, because it doesn't have trade agreements or preferential access, gives it a competitive disadvantage, and even in services, reform remains incomplete. But let's turn now to the COVID shock. What makes this strikingly different? That it's not a shock that originated in one part of the world like the tsunami or the mortgage crisis in the United States. It simultaneously hit some of the most important countries, well, not exactly simultaneously, but in very short period of time, the most important hubs in the global economy. At some point in March, 17 important hubs which accounted for where the largest number of COVID cases were there, accounted for 70% of the world trade. This is also leading to this mutually reinforcing contagion through both demand and supply channels. I'd like to focus on two aspects of this shock, which are relevant not so much to what's happening today, but what might happen in future. One is that trade policy is changing. The protectionist trend that we had begun to see is being accentuated. Second, that firms and households are being obliged to accelerate their investments in new technologies to try and overcome the rigid social distancing requirements. And this matters because these are going to be the lasting legacies of the COVID shock. First, on policy, we have seen this very sharply in medical goods, where countries, including India, have imposed export restrictions. But beyond that, we are also going to see huge recourse to subsidies and other forms of assistance to firms that are struggling. And finally, we are also seeing an asynchronous recovery. Many people say, oh, how can we take advantage of China's difficulties? The irony is that China is one country that's recovered faster than most others. And in fact, one challenge perhaps other countries will face is coping with Chinese competition, because Chinese industries have recovered. And I fear that that might also lead to a strong protectionist response, which will hurt all countries. On technology, one trend might well be reliance on automation, which exposes countries less or to dependence on foreign sources. But research in the WDR shows that we don't need to worry so much about it, because precisely the sectors that have become more automated, like car production, are the ones that have seen the fastest growth in imports from developing countries. This is because the scale and productivity effects of automation had dwarfed the labor substitution effects and also the import substitution effect. So at this stage, protection or automation has turned out to be more a boon than a curse. But as I said, in parallel, we are seeing investments which, and this is perhaps one of the more important uh, developments because of COVID, because in the past, a large number of transactions in areas most obviously like education and health could take place face to face within countries. Today, we are seeing both firms and households investing in new technologies, whether it's computers or Zoom or WebEx, to overcome the burdens of communication or face to face transactions. But that investment is a sunk cost, and it's having the dramatic effect of lowering the relative trade costs of transacting internationally relative to domestic. And those sunk costs mean that that rebalancing of domestic trade costs and international trade costs will persist. And that's likely to provide a big boost to services trade. Now, already it's interesting if you look at what's happening to services trade within the world today. You see three periods: January, February, March. And here you see the relative resilience, not of travel and transport, which have fallen dramatically, but a lot of digitally delivered services, from business services to telecommunications and financial services, have continued to grow, not just in China, which has recovered early, but even in the United States. I think this is a sign of basically services globalization, first being resilient during the crisis and then being boosted post-crisis. Why this matters is because India has, as I demonstrated earlier, a revealed comparative advantage. As I also said, it is a little bit perverse why we have a comparative advantage, but looking ahead, a key question which I won't labor because I've gone on too long already, is that the big challenge for India to continue to use services as an engine of not just growth but employment is not so much the skill intensity of services, but skill scarcity. Services can potentially generate a lot of direct and indirect unskilled employment. In fact, Indian services, $1,000 of Indian exports generate absolutely more unskilled employment than not just Indian manufacturing, but even Chinese manufacturing. So, but what inhibits the growth in unskilled employment is the scarcity of skills. So if we are to take advantage of these new opportunities, nothing is more important than fixing the dysfunctional skill production function in India, the quality of universities, and opening up that to reform is vital. At the same time, deep integration agreements are going to have a powerful role. A new database that we put together shows very strongly links in both goods and services value chains, not just because you accelerate reform at home and secure access to markets abroad, but the kind of deeper regulatory reassurance that is going to be needed in a post-COVID world, both in terms of goods standards in areas like agriculture, but also in services standards where it comes to data flows, are going to be vital for India's growth, but employment generating growth. So to conclude, India has both overachieved and underachieved in global value chains. It hasn't really taken advantage of labor intensive manufacturing, and it has made this precocious transition. But the concern is that the current model isn't generating jobs. We need to walk on two legs, that the COVID-19 challenge will be accelerated technological change and protectionist pressures. But as I argued, the technological change can in fact play to India's advantages, and protection is not inevitable if India were to engage both in deeper domestic reform, on the one hand, to remedy weaknesses in manufacturing, which my panelists will speak on, but also to reinforce its strengths in services, especially through improvements in education and steps that the government, both types of steps that the government is already taking. And finally, and this is what I would turn to Harsh to tell us more about, how this recalcitrant participation in both regional and multilateral negotiations has to be abandoned, and India has to take more of a proactive leadership role in international trade negotiations, both to spur domestic reform and secure access to foreign markets. Thank you, Rajesh. I'm sorry if it went on longer than you had wanted.
No, I think it was perfect, and I think a lot of discussion that would come up when others have spoken, particularly when you speak of moving back to international cooperation, and given the way the countries across the globe have been suffering post-COVID, and many of the countries would like to become self-reliant and Atmanirbhar. So this is going to be a very good discussion. Following when others have spoken, I am not going to ask questions at the moment, but I'll be waiting for discussion amongst all of you. And if I have any, I would raise, but I think we will have a good number of questions from the people who are at the moment listening to us. Thank you very much, Aaditya, for a wonderful presentation, and the context of the job creation, as well as what you have mentioned about the issue of new technologies because of social distancing. I had probably not given much thought to it, but that's a view, and that what you're saying is that is going to it might entrench or it might be there for a long time to come. So very good discussion points that you have raised. Thank you very much. Can we move on to Professor Atukarala for the next panelist, please?
Yeah. I'm having some problem in getting my PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoints? No.
Yeah, we can.
Yes, yes.
We can see.
Yeah, I can't see it. Yeah, but yeah.
Hope you are using the share screen option.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
That's why we are seeing it. So yeah, we're seeing a blank Google screen, Chandra.
Yeah. Yeah, just a minute. Yeah.
Yes.
We can see your screen. Chandra, you are muted. Please unmute. Please unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see now?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, we can also see.
Yeah, I'll start actually. I can see the screen on the other one, my computer. Rajesh, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this interesting discussion. I enjoyed very much Aditya's presentation. In his presentation, he made the interesting point that a shock, economic shock, naturally open up opportunities, but whether a given country benefit or not from these changes depend very much on economic fundamentals. I'm going to build on that important inference by placing India's experience in global production share, in global production networks, by placing India's experience in the wider East Asian context. Now, I'll start with a few figure and few tables to indicate India's relative performance in global value chain, particularly in manufacturing, compared to other countries. In this diagram, I compare developing countries' manufactured good exports and the importance of total exports within manufacturing value chain on the left-hand diagram, and India's performance on the right-hand diagram. What you can see is that out of total manufactured goods exports from developing countries, here I use the standard UN definition of developing countries. Out of total manufactured trade, closer to 2/3 take place within global value chain. Whereas in India, out of total manufactured exports, only about 35% take place within this value chain. Again, you can see in the next figures, the first part of the figures indicate share of in total world export of manufactured goods of each country and the share of GVCs within manufactured goods. What you can say is that India's share in manufactured export has increased following the reform from about 0.5% to about 2%. But other countries in the region have, during that period, have experienced much higher growth rate with the world market penetration in manufacturing trade. Staggering increase in China's share from 1.8 to over 23% during that period. Again, newcomer in this area, Vietnam, is experiencing very rapid market penetration. When you look at the next part of the figure, which indicates GVC share in exports, India has one of the lowest shares of GVC export in the region. Actually, it is comparable somewhat to Indonesia, but all the other countries have increased significantly their share within global value chain. In other words, the rapid market penetration of these countries has been underpinned by their integration into global value chain in manufacturing trade. Now, the issue we are discussing in this webinar is whether India can benefit from shifting production bases from China propelled by the COVID crisis. Now, we should not forget the fact that shifting production bases from China has been happening over the last 2 decades. with the increase in wages in the country, as well as other factors like more recently Trump's trade war, industrialists have, global manufacturers have been shifting production bases from China to other countries in the region and beyond. As Aaditya mentioned, actually there has not been reshoring, that means shifting production bases from China to US and other countries, but this restructuring is happening within the Asian region and to some extent concentrated within the East Asian region. Therefore, as Aaditya mentioned, we need to look at the issues from a long-term perspective. COVID crisis will create opportunities, but this has been a long-term trend. When China achieves maturity in manufacturing, production, and trade, naturally, there will be shifting production bases from China to other countries in the region. Now, to discuss why India has not benefited and what have been the main drivers of poor performance, I think a good starting point would be to use Samsung smartphone network story. I think it is an eye-catching story to highlight the relevant point. Now, smartphone production networks, basically the production locations are in 6 countries. Of course, Korea produce only parts and component and final assembly only for the domestic market. Out of total shipment of Samsung, only 10% take place from Korea. Then until 2010, about 2010, bulk of the final assembly of smartphone was in China, over 95%. However, in 2019, Samsung closed down operations in China. Why? Mainly because production bases have shifted to Vietnam. The first opening of a Samsung factory in Hanoi occurred in 2011. Most of the smartphones are now made in Vietnam. I put the word made. In fact, it is really assembled in Vietnam. Samsung produces more than 120 million units per year. It directly employs 150,000, the largest employer in Vietnam. Samsung accounts for 14% of total manufacturing exports from Vietnam. Look at India. Samsung opened a factory in Noida in Uttar Pradesh in 2018. Current production capacity, which is not fully utilized, is only 68 million units per year compared to 120 million in Vietnam. Direct employment of this production plant is just 5,000 compared to 150,000 in Vietnam. Production is entirely for the domestic market, no handphone export from India. Now compare India with Indonesia and Brazil. Actually, these 2 countries are much similar to India in terms of reaping gains from shifting Samsung production bases from China to other countries. The biggest gainer has been Vietnam. And again, you can clearly see the difference. Still, there are protectionist tendencies in India, Indonesia, and Brazil. And Samsung is located in these countries purely to produce for the protected domestic market. Now, why is the difference? What are the key determinants of GVC participation of a given country? GVC participation is driven by the phenomena called global production sharing. Breakup of the production process of a given product into vertically separated stages or tasks carried out in several countries. Now, global production sharing open up opportunities for countries to specialize different segments in the production process depending on its relative cost advantage. Particularly when it comes to final assembly, a country with large labor force like India had the advantage. As all of you know, until China emerged as the production center within global production network, in countries like Malaysia, even Singapore and Thailand, there were some final assembly like TVs, handphones, and so on. But when China started becoming an assembly center in the world, these assembly activities shifted to China. Now, these Asian countries specialize in mostly in component assembly, mostly to China as well as to rest of the world. Now, India, with a huge labor pool, has advantage in final assembly. Like in China, once final assembly start in a country, it can lead to development of a strong component base and a strong exporter within the global value chain. Now, since capital, managerial know-how, and technology are mobile within GVCs, relative labor cost is a key determinant of a country's attractiveness. However, successful participation in global value chain will occur only if labor cost advantage is matched by service link cost advantage, which I am going to explain in the next slide. At the same time, domestic investment climate need to be conducive for the operation of private sector firms, particularly multinational participation in the production base, simply because in most of the manufacturing value chains, multinationals are the lead firms. Local firms get the opportunity to enter the production network by linking with multinational operations. Now,
Chandra, another 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, the three.
Another 2 minutes.
Yeah, the three key points I highlighted. Firstly, labor and human capital services link cost, which is cost involved in coordination production blocks located across countries. And thirdly, proactive investment promotion or sell in the country to foreign investment, promote in the country. Now, labor, India has relative labor cost advantage compared to other countries in the region, particularly China, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on. But at the initial stage, availability of trainable, unskilled labor and middle level manpower combination is the key to get into production network. In the medium to long run, availability of high-level technical and managerial manpower become important. But overall, I think the human capital constraint is a little bit exaggerated in the current Indian policy debate. What we need is trainable, unskilled workers and middle-level manpower. In any case, human capital development is partly endogenous to the process as well. Then service link costs depend on whole range of factors impacting on the overall business environment, trade-related infrastructure and logistics. And again, when it comes to electronic, air transport is vital for penetrating international markets. According to my estimate, in Malaysia, out of total electronic export, 80% is air cargo. Then other points are clear to you: political stability, institutional quality, law and order, liberal trade and investment regime, and so on. Then market in the country, promoting foreign direct investment, actually bringing big players into the country isn't long-term investment. In Vietnam has tried hard to bring Samsung to the country, Intel and other big players that set up the stage for their electronic revolution. How, finally, 1 minute, how India fits, meet this requirement, labor market condition. I think in terms of labor cost, India is in a good position. Again, for final assembly, India has huge amount of surplus labor. However, other precondition, actually, I'm not an expert about Indian labor market situation. Perhaps we can discuss later. It is not scarcity of top level engineers, basically middle rank supervisory manpower. And again, labor laws and other things are important. Generally, India is not doing well compared to Vietnam. Then service link cost, India lagged behind China and other East Asian countries in terms of various indicators like the standard World Bank doing business indicator. And again, the new index of logistic performance, linear shipping connectivity and air connectivity. India is not doing well compared to China, even Vietnam, particularly relating to some of these indicators. Then foreign direct investment regime, lot has been written about it. There are various problems about lack of uncertainty, lack of certainty in the policy regime, and special economic zones, which have played a very important role in Vietnam and other countries, are not operating well in India. To sum up my discussion, my presentation, not only COVID crisis, but the basic changes in the overall economic setting in China is opening up opportunities for other countries. But so far, India has not benefited from these opportunities, particularly because even though the labor cost is low, other preconditions relating to meeting services linked cost requirement and providing an investment climate for the participation of private sector, particularly foreign direct investment, has not been that conducive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chandra. That sets the tone for the next presentation. If you can take your yes, I think what you said is that a lot more needs to be done in facilitating the operations or global value chains coming in India, or the flying geese paradigm getting fructified. And you said that labor market issues so we do have Dr. Rana Hassan, who does know the Indian labor market quite well. So I'm passing it on to Rana. Rana, all yours for 10 minutes, max 12.
Thank you very much, Rajesh. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this panel. And we've had two excellent presentations by Aaditya and Chandra. So I'm not going to, I'm actually no trade expert and even less so on global value chains, but I'll basically take 4 or 5 minutes. I'll try to stick to 4 or 5 minutes and just make a few points on this issue of manufacturing potential, because I think that's really implicit in the way you've structured this. When you say, can India gain its missed glory? I think it's really this missing of the whole manufacturing engine that you're probably referring to. So
Yes.
key messages really are, I think India absolutely needs Make in India to succeed. It in fact needs to make in India succeed. And it's a big challenge. Chandra mentioned a number of things. You have this whole issue with all sorts of infrastructure, logistics, the power side, etc. And essentially we have a regulatory framework that it really doesn't allow successful entrepreneurs to scale up, and it doesn't let unsuccessful ones exit as fast as you would like. And it's really an issue of problems in the land market and the labor market, and to some extent even in the capital market side. Now, certainly the agenda is demanding, but I would appeal to everyone who has any say in these things is, don't let two concerns distract. One is this standard thing of trade pessimism. So it keeps on coming back in one shape or the other. And I always worry that COVID-19 might be this new grounds for pessimism about trade. I think Aditya had put it nicely in the beginning. We've had all sorts of trade shocks. They do go away. I think COVID, fine. Vaccine takes 2 to 3 years. Herd immunity takes a longer time to come in, but trade is going to be there. You can chop off maybe even a couple of trillion. India's share is so small, it has lots of room to grow. The second thing that I would really urge people is not to let this technology and jobs pessimism issue interfere. So let me just show a few slides. When it comes to this issue of the manufacturing sector and jobs, we know it's not the quantum of jobs. In a lot of our discussions, we get bound up on this amount of direct employment that's being generated, etc. But it's not really just the quantum; it's the quality of jobs matter. And we know that larger firms tend to pay much better than smaller firms. And just a bit deeper into some of the numbers, Aditya, one of the slides he talked about 80% of Indian firms being less than 50 workers compared to about 15% for the Chinese. The situation is as you dig into the data, it's even more alarming. A vast majority of our manufacturing firms are these own account enterprises. You've got firms with 6 to 9 workers, even 10 to 19 workers. And when you are operating at that scale, you can never take advantage of technology. And here, I've got this photograph of the spreading machine. It's a simple machine used in the apparel sector. It spreads cloth, allows cloth to be cut quickly, efficiently, etc. And we did a study where we asked an industrial engineer to just cost out all these different types of technologies. We're not even talking about super sophisticated computer numerically controlled technologies, just standard technologies. And the bottom line is, small firms just are operating at scales where they cannot adopt these types of technologies. Small firms cannot adopt the kinds of managerial technologies that are needed really in the modern workplace. So what holds firms back? It's a long list of constraints. We've talked about infrastructure, the regulatory environment, this whole difficulty with entry and exit. It's also about administrative processes and inspection regimes. In the study that we had done on apparel, one of the interesting things was, we interviewed about 25 key stakeholders in the sector. And I remember talking to one person who, I was trying to push him on this issue of labor laws and just regulation. And his point was a good one. He said, the issue is not so much a particular law, it's the entire process that we have where there's just uncertainties about the law, uncertainties about the application of the law, and penalties which tend to be open-ended, etc. And it's these long delays that really we cannot handle. So it's not more than just any regulation. It's really these processes, the regimes. Let me just go ahead and skip a bit more. Just one point on skills. You know, a lot of people say, okay, skills are the problem. Certainly skills are very important, but they surely cannot be the binding constraint everywhere. In fact, coming back to apparel, you know, we asked firms, we showed them these three charts and we said, look, this is basically depictions of how fast people acquire skills. So which of these three pictures does it look like? Is it the top one where you acquire skills very slowly? Is it the bottom one where, you know, it's skill acquisition is important, it's ongoing, or is it something like the middle one? And every single person basically circled this. So in other words, for these sewing machine operators, you take about 4 to 6 weeks to get trained, you learn it quickly, and then you plateau. So it's just an example to show, yes, skills are important. It's not the binding constraint everywhere. In fact, we have to distinguish between foundational cognitive, non-cognitive skills. That is stuff that is best delivered by the government, or certainly paid for by the government for those who can't afford it. And then you've got sector-specific skills and firm-specific skills. I just want to say one thing on this issue of skills. You know, we too often people tend to think about skills as just something you acquire in schools or universities and that's it. But if you look at some of the very detailed evidence from the US, you find that a lot of human capital is actually accumulated on the firm, in the firm and on the job. But not any job will do. The type of firm you work in matters. And typically larger, more dynamic firms, if you're working in one of those, you're going to learn a lot more. I mean, each of us can think about that from our own experiences working in different types of firms and institutions. The type of firm you work in matters. And this is where, again, the Indian policy environment tends to encourage a type of firm which is very small. It's not acquiring much technology. It's not experimenting with things. And the result is you've got human capital that is stagnating. I am running out of time. Fortunately, the reform process has begun. We do see various types of state level reforms. We see an attempt to take these 45 central laws on labor and push them into 4 umbrella regulations. I think in terms of the big challenge moving ahead is it's really about moving the locus of safety nets from the firm to the state, because I think everyone will agree that when you give firms the flexibility to adjust labor, we also need a system whereby the workers are getting they're getting minimum wages, and they do have various mechanisms of social protection to rely upon. And I think that is a challenge, but that's really something we have to address head on. Let me, you know, on global value chains, again, so much has been said, and Aaditya and Chandra are just, you know, experts in this field, and I think they've made these points. I just wanted to show one slide where, you know, you've got Chinese exports and Indian exports in 2 sectors, apparel and transport. And it's interesting, if you compare the red and blue lines, you'll notice that India is not that different from China when it comes to, let's say, transport equipment. It's apparel where we're just totally left behind. Now, these are older numbers, things are changing, China's getting out of it. But again, it's this big puzzle. And I think the only way you can explain this puzzle whereby we're doing worse off in something that a labor abundant country should be doing well. And it's a sector where, my goodness, you know, we 200-300 years ago, we were the leaders. And again, now, when you dig into the firm size issues, you see this very stark difference. When it comes to firm size in motor vehicles, our firm size and the Chinese firm size is not all that different. You look at apparel on the left-hand side, extremely difficult. And to me, this is really something about the policy environment that is holding us back. I'll try to take just a minute more. I want to say something about automation anxiety because, you know, this always comes back and people say, you know, forget about manufacturing. It's not going to develop jobs. I think this is wrong on 2 fronts. Number one, if anything, you know, the global value chains literature really tells us that jobs are interconnected. In fact, you know, our former chief economist, Sheng Jin Wei, had done this really interesting study where he found that the big service export in Asia is, again, not India, it's China. And it's China not because of its direct exports of services, let's say the way India does it in terms of IT services. It's because of all the services that are embedded in Chinese manufacturing exports. So let's not get carried away with the technology story. Yes, I recognize that, talking about the automatic fabric spreader is one thing, and then you have this zero worker Adidas factory on the other hand. But I think we're far from that situation. Also, we have to remember that in a country like India, you may have a displacement effect where automation reduces the number of workers required to produce a given level of output, but the scope for scaling up is so huge that essentially you can really ramp up output so much that your total employment will go up. And in fact, I'm just going to give you a chart from history. This is from James Besson's work for the United States. And he makes a very interesting point. And he says that if you look at the employment trajectories in both textiles and automobiles, you see a sort of inverted U. And what's interesting is you look at this upward sloping part. This is employment going up exactly at the time when firms were introducing new labor-saving technologies. And the reason employment goes up is because the market expands. And in India, I mean, if we just think about, the number of apparel pieces that people own, et cetera, the types of products they have, there really is so much scope to expand that I don't think we should let these things be slowing us down and really trying to unlock the manufacturing industry. Now, I'm pretty much going to stop here. I just want to end with a couple of points on special economic zones. And it's very useful for me because Chandra actually ended on this issue of special economic zones. We talk about having special economic zones, and yes, we had one of the first economic zones, I think started in Kandla in the late 60s. But the fact of the matter is that when we talk about our economic zones and the kinds of economic zones we've seen in other places, you really see a lot of differences. And I think a couple of key ones are, number one, scale. The scale at which you need these things to work is huge. Having small zones and expecting some big changes to take place, positive changes to take place, I think is unrealistic. And that's why at ADB we've been working quite closely with the government of India, in particular Andhra Pradesh and also Tamil Nadu, trying to develop zones across these transport corridors where we also invest in ports, expressways, power, and the private sector comes in and sets up these economic zones. So anyways, let me stop there, Rajesh. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rana, for a wonderful presentation, and that the issues that you have raised about the special economic zones have been discussed for a long time. I think it's time to say that post-COVID, if like other stimulus packages that are being announced, we look forward to. So what I have taken till now, that we have discussed about the issues of trade cooperation, that India still has the opportunity to move to global value chains, the issue of scale, that technology in various ways is helpful. And finally, I think another issue that I have picked up is, Rana, from your presentation, is the discussion on special economic zones where Chandra had left. Now, over to Harsha, Dr.
Thank you.
Harsha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think we've had three very, very good high-quality presentations. A lot of very important points were made. I'll try and stick to the question of global value chains. But what I want to take up is the point you made about Atmanirbharta, which basically is interpreted normally as an inward-looking economic policy. But even when the Prime Minister was announcing about Atmanirbharta, he talked about India playing a strong role in global value chains. Similarly, when the Trade and Industry Minister tried to explain that further, global value chains are a very important part of that. And I think, especially in the current context, it is very important to keep global value chains in mind, because you cannot be part of a global value chain without a strategic perspective, without good coordination and policy which makes you competitive. While the focus primarily has been on domestic policies and not necessarily domestic policies at the border, but there is a link between the two. And as Aaditya talked about, the market access abroad, that's something also which plays a good role. So if we need to be an active, increasing part of global value chains, it has to be a comprehensive effort. For that, one of the things which Aaditya pointed out, and then again, the following two presentations also emphasized, is that countries actually switch to reliable and low-cost players or locations, and uncertainty about law, implementation of law, open-ended penalties, which Rana, you talked about. These are actually about stability and reliability of policy, which was mentioned by Aaditya. Then another very important point which Aaditya made is an attempt to do everything means low success everywhere. This is something as a policy maker, I think becomes very important, because as a policy maker, you cannot really look after 100 different things at the same time. You have to prioritize. You have to prioritize sectors. You have to prioritize policies. I'll say a little bit more about that. As far as COVID is concerned, yes, protectionist trend is accelerating. The trend is not in favor of more global value chain linkages, but it's expected to be less. What Aaditya showed is that perhaps the nature of the global value chain linkages is likely to change fundamentally due to technology. Then, as far as improvement of skills, and I completely agree with Rana about 1 to 1.5 months. It is not just apparel. Even in mobile phones, the feedback I got from firms in India is it takes them 1 month to train a completely novice labor. And the other input I got is that the firms are finding that Indian labor is 30% more productive than the Chinese labor. So the labor productivity, and there is, in my mind, there is some difference of opinion about the wages in Vietnam and India. Actually, wages in Vietnam are slightly higher than India. It was the labor productivity which made effective wages lower in Vietnam, especially for apparel sector. But now if you go to mobile kind of activities, then it is really surprising that the labor is showing higher productivity than even China. So I just want to say that in a post-COVID period, our first priority, of course, is to address the social situation. And in that context, some policy framework has to be devised which addresses social situation, but economics also has an impact on social situation. That is why the concern about opening factories, enabling transactions, domestic, and even for exports, the airports, etc., were kept open. The problem is, in a situation like post-COVID, what people don't remember is that a global value, we normally think in terms of goods and services. Actually, as far as the global value chain is concerned, it is far more than just goods and services. It's also technology. It is labor. One of the reasons why firms could not export from India, and these are regular large exporting firms who use the air freight route, is because the laborers or the officers were not coming because of COVID. So you have the whole system open, but it's not functioning. And that becomes a major constraint. And normally people don't think about these kind of things in global value chains. We talk about FDI, inviting FDI, but when we are trying to attract the company, we must actually formulate our policy in a very timely manner. If you try and see how much time has elapsed between when US, China first began the trade tension and when the policies on 3 sectors were announced on 21st March this year. So it's a long period of time, and within that time, other countries are trying to attract that FDI. Similarly, if people want to come and see the condition in India, the senior executives require visas. it has to be part of our policy chain, which goes with the value chain. So together with every global value chain is a policy chain. And that means that you have different departments, you have different ministries, the goods and services which go in, as well as the center and the state. So very high level coordination committees have to be established, because many of these departments have very different objectives. Exports have to be made a national objective, but so is the objective for a custom official to get revenue. And often the implementation policy for revenue focuses on, by that I mean department, customs, focuses on earning more revenue irrespective of the impact on exports. So there is a need to better coordinate and get a balanced kind of approach to different conflicting objectives, and you need high-level decision-making for that. So coordination has to be a major part of it. Then the thing is that actually the chain, we keep talking about global value chain, it is a web. Because in the chain you see different links. Each one of those has its own value chain. And within that, each one of them has its own value chain. Just imagine the kind of inventory policy which you have to manage. If you're trying to be the lead firm which is managing the firm, one particular firm in the area of mobile, for example, gets 1,500 parts from 200 different firms, small and medium and large. It's a mind-boggling exercise. Any policy change, any delay in policy has an impact on operational costs, has an impact on existing contracts in the export market. And the export market is finicky. You bring delay, you change conditions which have an impact on operational costs. That implies a difficulty for global value chain. So we have to be very, very sensitive of the impact of policies on working capital, not just overall cost, because an integral part of value chain or value web is managing inventories, and which means timely response, consistent quality, cost efficient kind of thing. And moreover, these value chains, I'll continue to call them chains, are managed by lead firms. Now, lead firms may be very different in different industries. For example, if I take the mobile sector, the lead firms are international firms. The top three account for 70% of the global market. There is no major lead firm from India. You go to two-wheelers, the major firms are Indian. The value chain is dominantly Indian. You go to automobiles, they are a mixture. They are Indian and they are foreign. And you go to apparel or textiles, a large number of Indian firms. You can't even identify main firms there. So when you have to have a policy, you have to identify which sector do I want to have the policy for. Once you prioritize the sector, the policy and strategy has to be sector specific. And when you do a list of problems these industries face, you will get about 100 different policies. You can't manage it. You have to identify what are the policies with the largest impact, which can be addressed in the shortest time period. And there are two categories in this. One, and this means you have to consult and discuss with the industry. One is that actually the government of India has put in place a lot of very good policies. The problem from my interaction with various industry players is that in several cases, it's not the policy which is missing, it's the implementation which is not taking place. Sometimes it takes place in such a manner that it becomes retrogressive. And therefore, a focus on implementation of the policy has to be there. So policy has to be in a post-COVID situation. We don't have the luxury of taking our time to decide what needs to be done in a manner which is highly effective and efficient in a short period. Because when the market starts taking off, there'll be many who will be there in the game trying to get market share. And that game has begun even now. So you have to have a specific institutional mechanism to monitor implementation. You can come up with hundreds of policies, all brilliant policies. If they are not implemented, they are useless. You have done nothing. So, and this is true whether it is for giving subsidies or whether it's to clear customs in a fast manner. So the implementation part becomes very important. After that, if you have a dynamic kind of perspective, because a domestic ecosystem, we keep talking about global value chains, but a global value chain cannot be sustained in a domestic context without a domestic ecosystem. That's the way China has come up. That's the way Vietnam is trying to come up. That's the way Bangladesh is trying to come up. That's the way any country which connects with global value chains has to come up. And an ecosystem means that there has to be effective policies to address skills. There has to be an identification of where handholding is required and errors made in past policies, because we are not new to the game. So in this, it's easiest to go forward if we learn from experience of successful countries. The government recently has done exactly that in the case of 3 different industries for which it announced policies on 21st March, production-linked incentives. And it has now got a framework for analyzing relative disabilities of India due to policies which are followed by the success cases. And here, let's not focus on China. China, one can learn from, but emulating China is not easy. We were talking about air freight. There's one particular large player which produces mobile phones. The Chinese built an airstrip for that company when it was established. Now they are building the 4th airstrip. So it's in a different world altogether. Some of their companies start making profits even before they have produced one single unit of the product. So we have to try and see if we got to get market access in a GVC context, which are the players which are there. In some cases, these are domestic players. In some cases, these are foreign players. So if you got to invite FDI, you have to really talk to them and see what is required. And India has started doing that. India has put aside land with India's the Sagarmala, Rana, the Sagarmala thing. I was fascinated by when I got to know that you are working with these various mechanisms in India also. We can piggyback on existing kind of efforts and just have a multiplier effect from there. So as I said, that in addition to that, we got to maintain the dynamic advantage. One thing which, when we look of dynamic advantage, we always think of R&D. R&D defined in a technical manner is not the only thing you need. There is a softer kind of R&D called design capacities or design capabilities. The content of design is very different in textiles apparel, where it's almost an everyday affair. And in mobile phones, it's a different matter. But one of the demand of domestic major firms in mobiles in India is to have a design ecosystem, because that's what gives them an edge and a continued capability enhancement over time. So in addition to plug and play, you must have this kind of synergy also. I've already said that complementary with a global value chain is a policy chain.
Harsha, 2 more minutes, please. 2 more minutes, please.
Very quickly, I'll try and finish it. Is a policy chain. And one of the models of good coordination is the National Committee on Trade Facilitation, where the trade facilitation issues are taken up through joint effort in a very tangible manner. Similarly, so I've talked about priority sectors, priority policies. There are examples you have. So the monopolistic rates at ports, charges for certification. Why should Indian ports have charges which are 3 to 4 times the international ports? That's a direct area of intervention to fix it. Similarly, why should even leave alone standards, which are very difficult, even marking and labeling requirements domestically imposed be different from those which are required for our main export markets? And they are. That means they have to then, when they leave the border in India, they have to change it somewhere before they actually clear it in the international border elsewhere. It could be high seas, it could be somewhere, you know, at the airport abroad, whatever. But it is unnecessary. Where should I put a label? Is that something we have to insist on? So there are areas which are immediately apparent. Similarly, short and medium term strategy should be clear, and importance of digital, importance of virtual inspections, stocking arrangements. There are tools available with international organizations. ITC has tools for these. We can use it. Similarly, World Bank would have tools. Now I'm going to address one other thing, which is the point which Aaditya raised about FTAs. We have a fear of FTAs because of the kind of experience which we have focused on with Japan, Korea, and ASEAN. These are countries with much higher non-tariff barriers than India. In our FTAs, we have not really engaged to develop a mechanism such as in CPTPP, they have this provision 2.9.2, where if you have a problem with your exports, whether it be tariffs or non-tariff measures, you have a bilateral discussion where the other party should address your problem in a timely manner. We can do that. That is something which the review of the FTAs would have to do. But at the same time, there's a possibility of a bilateral discussion mechanism. We don't need to go through an FTA. There are ways in which you can actually develop certain mechanisms bilaterally. So that should be done, especially for NTPs or standards, and it is actually done in the case of agriculture products. So we have to just expand that. Similarly, there are industries in India which actually want FTAs. I'll give you 2 examples. Automobiles, they want FTAs with countries we are not even focusing on. In Africa, Latin America, etc. There isn't the same kind of concern as with the larger markets which want a huge reduction in tariffs, etc. Although I must share that the free trade area for Africa, that agreement has a 90% tariff line reduction. So you can't avoid tariff line reduction, but there are very many innovative safeguard mechanisms, flexibilities, which have been used by the US itself. You take a look at the snapback safeguard, which US had agreed with Japan in the auto kind of bilateral thing under TPP. Similarly, there's something which it has in the bilateral US-China kind of agreement. So we have, and there are some examples in WTO also. So we have to really be prepared, identify where our concerns are, and see how we can delay it or get more oxygen if we are being strangled, etc., with problems there. But at the same time, now US has begun a new method of addressing FTAs, which is that I will get an agreement in a limited number of areas, you know, early harvest kind of thing. We can do that also. The second example in FTAs was apparel wants FTAs with EU and US. US, of course, will be a completely new FTA, but the few sticking points we have with Europe Can we have some kind of an early harvest there, which it may include one of their sectors, which is difficult for us, but as well as apparel exports from us? That will level the playing field vis-a-vis Bangladesh or even now Vietnam. So there are different ways to find solutions to FTAs, but we have to change our approach, because if we want to be linked with global value chains, we can't just always keep relying on FDI. Certain sectors, it might be okay, like mobiles. These are large companies with presence in major markets, with high quality products. So the market actually is available to them more easily. In several other sectors, we have to look at creating similar, or at least move in the direction of market access, which our competitors have. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to share with you. Sorry that if I've shot over the time, but I had more to say, but I realize that time is of essence. Thank you very much, Rajesh.
Thank you, Harsha. This was really enlightening, and I agree with you that I did notice that in the stimulus package, the global value chains has been discussed many a time. So global value chains and make in India, assemble in India. So they are all kind of tied up with each other. Now we have run over time, but I do have questions. If the participants have the patience and if the panelists agree with me, can I just raise few of them, and so that there can be some interesting discussion from, so maybe each of you can take the way you would like to take the questions. So the first one is that if India is, this is a question that comes to us so many times. If India is doing well in services, why should GVCs-led manufacturing sector be given, is there any special benefit from manufacturing-led GVC? So that's a standard question that is posed to us. So there is I'm not naming, because some of the questions have come as anonymous, so I'm not naming anybody. So if services, India is doing well in services, what is the need for GVC in manufacturing? The second kind of questions that I have got is that post-COVID, it is the employment generation which is of essence, is important, that would help in poverty reduction. So obviously, directly asking the question, what happens when people have lost employment, and how do we kind of take care of that? The third one is that what are the sectors, particular sectors in which GVCs can be more relevant than the other sectors? The fourth kind of questions that I've got is about MSMEs and their role. We suffer from the problem of missing middle-sized firms here. And a question that comes is, the basic message from all panelists is that COVID-19 changes nothing. And that, so this is an important question, and that market access has not fundamentally changed. This is not the conclusion that our Prime Minister has reached. Why is this government so negative on RTAs? How important are those for India's engagement in GVCs compared with domestic reform? So basically a question of regional trade agreements and their importance. Lastly, I think there is a question on, is it possible for India to be the next factory of the world after China? I think a lot has been discussed already. But lastly, I think, what does government need to do to enable the growth of these sectors? Which means, I think the same person asking that which are the sectors, and how can the government address, even though I think there is a lot that has been discussed and said. Would 5 minutes each be fine? Can we start in the same order that we started? Aditya, with you?
Or should we do reverse order now, Rajesh?
Reverse order, then it is, yeah. because Harsha made you first and him last. So I give Harsha the first opportunity then.
So I'll address 4 of these questions, which I wrote down.
5 minutes, right?
Okay,
we've run
5
out.
minutes. You tell me when my 5 minutes are over, or at least 4 minutes are over. So, why have manufacturing in GVCs? By definition, GVCs include services and manufacturing. So you can't separate the two. It's a chain which comprises both. So to say that that's where the one lesson of GVCs was that even manufacturing production actually includes services. So if you start saying have no manufacturing in GVCs, then what you are saying is don't emphasize GVCs. So that is not correct. If you're saying don't emphasize manufacturing exports, then just imagine how much is going to be the reduction in opportunity which you're giving up, or the reduction if you don't emphasize manufacturing in terms of jobs, in terms of income earned, etc. So no, you must give emphasis to the system as a whole, and within that, manufacturing and services, and then the industry will see opportunities and take whatever is possible. So poverty reduction drawing on experience of NICs. The NICs actually, if I look at from my understanding and reading of their experiences, is they prepared their population through education, skills, etc. They provided good social network services. By network, I mean health, education, the possibility of, except China. China was weak on that, of pensions after you retire, etc. And they focused on growth and productivity enhancement through international trade. So if we want that, then that is the path. In India, the situation is far more complex, both because of politics as well as the different levels at which decision-making takes place. And often you have to actually focus on poverty reduction through safety nets, namely some kind of direct income transfer, etc. So India has begun on that, and India has also begun looking at GVCs very seriously. And Rajesh, not just in the production-linked initiative, which you mentioned, even in the Atmanirbharta announcement, the Prime Minister has emphasized GVCs.
Yes, absolutely.
That's something which I was struck by. Then the other question is, post-COVID, nothing has changed. No, post-COVID, tremendous things have happened. One, you have major problems to deal with. Your system today is for all practical purposes is actually broken. It needs to be repaired. Countries are going to look more towards themselves or towards regions closer to them. Value chains, actually global value chains, are primarily regional value chains. Most of them are within the region itself, whether it be Asia, whether it be Europe, whether it be Americas. And RTAs and Indias and GVCs, the new RTAs are being developed in such a way that the members actually are able to have easier possibilities of developing just the RTA specific GVCs. So if we want to be part of GVCs, these RTAs are very important. Second, if we want to be part of GVCs in the sense of being able to sell our products, then we need to also have market access. That is if the initiative is from us. But if we want to be part of GVCs, by having a low value participation in GVCs, where each RTA has a local content requirement, content requirement for the product which is being exported. So if you have a high value addition in the value chain of a product and you don't have an RTA, then your product will face a higher tariffs. So if you just want to piggyback on somebody else who has an RTA and just be in the lower echelons of the GVCs, that's a possibility. Otherwise, we have to have RTAs in order to get larger value from the GVC, which we are a part of. What does government need to do to enable the sectors? Which sectors? The government has already announced several sectors. So in that context, you have 6 superstar sectors which were announced in Make in India context. There are 2 services sectors there and 4 manufacturing sectors. There are other priority sectors which have been announced. Recently, the policy which was announced on 21st March was pharmaceuticals with a focus on some basic products which are the basis for creating medicines, medical devices, and electronics, in which they looked at mobile phones and they looked at other electronic products, parts and components. So these are obviously priority items. In addition, there are automotive products, there are textiles and apparels. So criteria can be technology, potential for exports, employment, etc. But the government has already announced those, and how you need to enable those sectors. As I said, you have certain regular policies which apply across the board to sectors. And that means, for example, sometimes when there is a re-evaluation by customs of a product category and they announce a change, they often say the change applies retrospectively.
Harsha, 5 minutes. 5
Okay.
minutes are
I just need half a minute more. So this really disturbs the value chain. It disturbs your contracts, even if it's a product in which there is no value chain. If you have to sell abroad and you have a contract, you can't change the terms and conditions. So stability and predictability of policies are very, very important. In this context, these are across the sector, but some of these policies, which are the lead firms, what are the shortages which they face, what are the key obstacles, those kind of policies could be sector specific. Thank you.
Thanks, Harsha. Thank you very much. And now to Rana.
Rajeshji, thank you very much. So there were, I think, a couple of questions addressed to me, and perhaps this question on, if we're doing well in services, why do we care about the manufacturing-led? So 2 points on this. One is it's almost as if you've got this huge potential market out there. Like as I'd mentioned, I think this is these might be numbers that are 1 or 2 years old, but India's share in merchandise exports 1.7%, China's 13%. India's really underperforming. Why leave this opportunity untouched? And I think the things that have been preventing us from exploiting these export market, really so many of these are related to the domestic policy environment. So I don't see what one gets from keeping a system that is not working in place. There's nothing to be gained. The second point is, if one of the interesting things that the global value chain literature and analysis does is it shows how interconnected things are. So as I'd mentioned, when you look at the service exports that China is able to actually make, working indirectly through its manufacturers, you see the interlinkages. So frankly, thinking in terms of manufacturing versus services, I don't think we need to do that at all. The way I see it, I see a big policy barrier on the manufacturing side, and my point is unleash it. You'll just get much more employment, much more output, much more productivity. I think that was probably, there was maybe another question or two. There was something about repeating the points mentioned about the fact that manufacturing doesn't create jobs. Again, I think that was in the context of the point I was making about technology, that yes, technology does mean that you produce the same amount of output with fewer workers, but the real world is not static. you expand in terms of scale. And like those charts I had shown for the United States in the 19th century, India is very similar. This is a very big country. The amount of potential demand that is there, whether in apparel, whether in all sorts of light consumer goods, is really huge. So I just don't see that much of an issue of the per unit employment generation coming down being a huge problem, because I really see the scale, the possibility of just expanding the scale of production to be quite large. Let me stop there.
Thank you. And now with Chandra.
Yeah,
Professor
I'll just quick. Yeah, I would like to add a few things related to what Rana said about the role of manufacturing value chain in employment generation and poverty reduction. The very concept of global production sharing, which is the driving force of global value chain, means that countries can specialize in different segments of the production process in line with their relative comparative advantage. In a labor abundant country, therefore, manufacturing within global production network tend to be more labor intensive, and labor is the only resource owned by the poor. Therefore, creating jobs is the surefire way to reduce poverty. Compare India and China. China started the reforms with a poverty rate of 49%. 49% of the population was above the below the poverty line. Now the poverty rate has declined to less than 1%. In India, poverty rate has declined. Still, 1/3 of the world poor live in this country, and the poverty rate has not declined as in China. Number of very good recent studies like Arvind Panagaria and Vijay Joshi, they have clearly highlighted that poverty outcome has not been impressive in India, mainly because one of the reasons is that India has not got into specialization in manufacturing value chain. The second quick point is the comparison between services and manufacturing. That's a beautiful discussion in Vijay Joshi's new book, India's Long Road. It is true that there are shining examples like software industry generating high paid jobs, but most of the jobs in the services sectors are very low paid, low quality jobs. Manufacturing sector is the only sector in a country which can hire unskilled workers and train them on the job for relatively better jobs. This is a well-known point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Aditya, as you wished, you are the next.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you again, Rajesh, and the panelists for deeply insightful contributions. In response to the questions, I'll highlight 3 points. One, the distinction between goods and services matters, because given the current state of tradability and relative skill intensity, India cannot reduce poverty and generate jobs through services alone. I think the key problem has been, and in this respect, as Prem Chandra said, India resembles Indonesia. The domestic market continues to lure India into this sense that we can grow and be self-sufficient. I think it's imperative that India exploit the kind of economies of scale and the kind of technology benefits that come from harnessing the global market. And it's interesting, one point that Rana made, it's true that China sells perhaps more services indirectly because it has a flourishing manufacturing sector. India is an outlier in business services in that it sells most of its services directly rather than embodied in its manufacturing sector. And you need growth in manufacturing precisely for the reason that Prem Chandra said, that is the sector, apparel and leather goods and other labor-intensive sectors which generate jobs. As I said, services also generate a lot of unskilled jobs, but the kind of complementary skills that are needed in services would require an implausibly rapid growth in India's skill production. And that I don't see happening in the near future. The second point is really, what does COVID do? COVID, as I said, is really changing and going to change technologies. One is going to encourage automation. And here I think Rana and I are on the same page. In manufacturing, that automation does not immediately threaten prospects for labor intensive production because the scale benefits dwarf the substitution away from labor. Then the digitization is creating remarkable opportunities and services which India must continue to exploit. But given the importance of manufacturing, and this is my final point, there is a narrow window today for India. This is a window between rising real wages in China and falling prices of robots. If the robot prices fall faster than real wages rise, Foxconn, which is based in China, will not move production away from China. It will choose a robot over an Indian worker. How do you exploit that? I think it's really the reforms that my co-panelists have emphasized. And there are subtle aspects. You see, when people talk about labor market rigidity, I have a colleague, Preetam Banerjee, who said, many firms are, Maruti in Gurgaon has 80% contractual labor and very few employees who are subject to these laws. But there is a subtle point which relates to something that Rana said. If learning by doing on the job is really important, insecurity of contract can lead to slower, higher turnover and less learning on the job because the willingness of the firm to invest in training workers gets diluted. I think that is number one. Number two, this whole idea where people are debating of whether self-sufficiency and global value chains in the same speech add up. The problem is the actions, and the problem is the protection in inputs. When you look at this very nice example of Vietnam that Prem Chandra talked about, Vietnam, 70% of its exports, of 70% of its GDP are manufacturing exports, but 70% of its GDP are also manufacturing imports. It's recognizing that you cannot do everything, that cheaper access, and this is the puzzle. India imposes high tariffs on imports of yarns and fiber, and that has inhibited the development of its apparel sector, where it's losing out to countries like Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And the final point I want to make is that corporate taxes are not a substitute for reform. That it is really important to make these deeper reforms which enhance the competitiveness. And here, a secret ingredient which is becoming even more transparent in the world is the quality of institutions and state institutions. That same Vietnam, which is taking away market share and which is becoming the destination of choice for people leaving China, is also a country which has contained COVID without a single death. And that's why we have to take an integrated view of policy. And I think it has to be a priority in the world to try and not just remedy the acute health costs and human pain, but also create the conditions for recovery, which would alleviate the deep economic distress that all countries are going to face now. Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Aditya. And I would really wish to thank all of you, my panelists today. Sincere thanks to Dr. Aaditya Mattoo, Professor Prem Chandra Thukarala, Dr. Rana Hassan, and Dr. Harsha Vardhana Singh for providing such a, we are already half an hour over time, but we still have a good number of participants stay with us. Some of them have left, but I think this is one thing which is post-COVID, that we could have all of you and we could have about 70 or maybe 80 participants who listen to this discussion. And this discussion is going to probably go to the website so that anybody who would like to see it later would also be able to. And obviously, with this discussion, we get, at least I got enriched much more than I was at 5:30 p.m. So thank you very much to all of you for joining, and have a very nice day for those in the US, and good night to Manila and Canberra. Obviously, for you, Chandra, it's quite late. I understand. It must be around midnight, 12 there, if I'm not wrong. So, a very good evening and best wishes to all those who stayed with us, and all those who joined from different places. I have already wished them have a nice day and good night and so on and so forth. So thanks once again. My sincere, heartfelt, warm thanks to Harsha, Aditya, Chandra, and Rana. And with this, I think we close. And thanks very much to the participants who have still stayed with us despite our being half an hour late, because the discussion was. So thank you very much, participants, and thank you very much those from my team, Brookings India, who are behind the scene but have managed everything so well that nothing went wrong during the discussion. Thanks to my team at Brookings India. Thanks to all of you, and look forward to much more interaction with you. Aditya, please do visit us when you come next. And Chandra, it's long time that I have seen you. So Rana, likewise. So Harsha ji, thank you. And I think we close here, unless anyone wants to make any comments.
Thank you
Rajesh.
very, very much. Fantastic strategy, and thank you to
you.
Chandra, Dr. Harsha.
I met you a long time ago at ANU. Aditya.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.